to a simple faith. According to legend, the Cathars were guarding a secret treasure, possibly the Holy Grail, and they were hiding it in Montségur fortress. To crush the heretics, the Pope launched a crusade against the Cathars. In spring 1244, more than 200 Cathars were burned at the stake, but not before the Holy Grail was moved to a safer place. To this day, there is no evidence to suggest the treasure the Cathars were guarding was the Holy Grail, and how it was smuggled out of the besieged castle also remains a mystery. This small church is on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. It is said that for centuries, this niche held the Holy Grail. In the 12th century, many Grail romances were written. In 1210, the German Knight Templar Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote a beautiful poem describing the adventures of Parzival. Wolfram viewed the Grail as an object, a stone with magical powers. Like the mythical Horn of Plenty, this stone offered food and eternal youth. His knowledge is believed to have derived from a man called Quixote, which is a diminutive of Guillaume. We are hoping to find out the true identity of the person behind this mysterious name. The trail leads us to Toledo, in Spain. At the time, Toledo was a center for sciences and literature. The legacy of centuries is collected in the archive of the city's cathedral. Manuscripts and books written in Arabic, Hebrew and Latin. And there is evidence of the author of the original story of the Grail. In a document from the 12th century, we came across a scribe from the south of France. He signed himself Guillaume of Narbonne, in Latin, Narbonensis Guilhelm. If he is the man who Wolfram referred to, then he must be the author of the original story of the Grail, the mysterious Quixote. The document was commissioned by Queen Urraca, the wife of King Alfonso I. Alfonso ruled over Aragon and Navarra in the mid-12th century, a time when the veneration of the Grail had reached its first peak. Following Quixote's descriptions, we traveled to eastern Spain in search of further clues. This is the church of San Pedro el Viejo, in the small town of Huesca. King Alfonso I regularly came here for quiet contemplation. We know that here too, the Grail was long venerated. The name Alfonso, Anfortius in Latin, is related to Anfortas. Anfortas, in turn, is the name of the king in the Grail story. Was the king of Aragon and Navarra the historical model for the keeper of the Grail? Did the ruler have himself and his dynasty immortalized in the Grail poem? There is one more similarity. As the historical King Alfonso I retired to his castle at the end of his life to nurse a fatal wound, the Grail King Anfortas waited to be delivered from his endless torments. There was only one person who could bring them deliverance, the future keeper of the Grail, Parsifal. In the Grail romance, Parsifal journeyed for many years before he found the mysterious castle of Anfortas. The name Parsifal also leads us to Spain, where a Spanish count may have been the model for the knight Parsifal. The count was the king's cousin. His nickname was Perche de Val, or Parsifal. And he was not just a legendary figure. His name is on this family tree. But what about the places mentioned in the Grail story? On this abandoned chapel, a cross, held like a weapon, has been carved into the wall. It is a symbol of the Knights Templar. The Templars, who guarded the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, became the keepers of the Grail.
Here we find something remarkable, the remains of a hermitage, or those of later structures, which is mentioned in Parsifal in connection with the Grail Castle. The hermitage is here, and the Grail Castle is here. The two are placed in relation to one another in such a way that it is very likely that this is the path that is repeatedly described in the poem.
It is believed that the Grail Castle was located close to here, concealed in the wilderness, invisible to the naked eye. We begin our search within a 20-kilometer radius of this spot. In the Middle Ages, castles were a symbol of strength and rule. They were erected on sites that commanded respect, even from a great distance.
The castle was the mightiest building visible to the naked eye from a great distance. Now, when we hear that a castle is impossible to find, invisible, indeed only accessible in a state of grace, it is such a paradox that one is initially stunned and baffled. One must take this into consideration in order to understand the impact this story had on people in the Middle Ages. A castle that was invisible was utterly unimaginable. But the whole thing would have been a very pale story indeed if the epic, this myth, did not contain some grain of truth. And here it is. We take a path that apparently leads nowhere and suddenly see this castle before us.
In a remote valley in the Spanish Pyrenees is a perfectly hidden castle. This is the fortified abbey of San Juan de la Peña. It's the place where the mortally wounded King Alfonso I was taken. The inner courtyard is impressive.
We have here a double row of burial niches in the courtyard of the abbey and find a very interesting representation. An anchor has been worked into this Christian symbol. Parsifal had an anchor in his coat of arms, so we may assume that this anchor is a further link in the larger chain of evidence that we are trying to uncover.
Barcelona, Spain. In the royal register in the town's library, there is further evidence of the Grail. A document refers to the fortified abbey and a gift. The gift is an object described, half in Spanish and half in Latin, as a calice lapideum, or stone chalice. The same stone chalice was reputed to have been in the chapel at San Juan de la Peña. In the oldest part of the abbey, there are vaults hewn out of stone, ideal for housing the Grail.
We imagine that the Grail was kept in this lower section, wholly within the rock, in a niche or on the altar.
The chapel mentioned in the document from the Royal Register is located above the vaults. It is constructed like a temple. This is the room that Parzival was searching for, and which the Grail literature describes as a temple inside a castle. According to the story, when Parzival finally reached the Grail castle after his many adventures, he witnessed the Grail procession. It was led by the Grail maiden. Behind her, a porter carried the lance used to pierce the side of Jesus Christ. The blade of the lance never ceased to bleed. A female bearer was also present. She carried the platter upon which the head of John the Baptist supposedly lay. On this occasion, Parzival didn't deliver the wounded King Alfonso I from his suffering. Only during his third visit to the castle did Parzival bring deliverance.
This is the little door which Wolfram von Eschenbach mentions, and through which the Grail maiden Réponse de Scheuer carried the Grail in solemn procession to place it before the Grail king and fortress. The Grail king and fortress resided here, and the Templars protected the Grail. Thus we must suppose that the Grail castle, San Juan de la Peña, is the historical starting point for the story of the Grail as it still exists in our literary tradition.
We are now almost at the end of our quest for the Holy Grail. The final part of our journey will take us to Valencia, in Spain.